Under the rustling canopy of maple trees and the golden sunlight draped like silk across the branches, a small wooden cabin rested quietly in the serene green heart of Vermont. There were no blaring car horns, no glowing screens alerting of incoming meetings, only the hush of wind sweeping across the porch, the faint fragrance of wildflowers, and the gentle breath of the earth awakening after a long winter. Thomas stood on the porch, one hand resting on the time-worn railing. His face bore the marks of exhaustion etched by the many days he had lived on edge. Once a tech engineer immersed in relentless deadlines, he now sought refuge in nature, like a weary bird returning to an old nest. 2 years ago, he had lost his wife to a terminal illness. And with her, he had lost more than a partner had lost direction. But there was one thing he had never let go of: Sophie. Sophie, his 10-year-old daughter with bright eyes and hair as soft and brown as chestnut swaths, sitting in a patch of wildflowers, gently brushing her fingers across the lavender swaying in the breeze. Deaf since birth, her world was one of light and vibration, no words, no sound, only feeling. Thomas had brought his daughter here not to run from sorrow, but to discover a new way to communicate it through words, but through sensation. He believed that in this place, where bees still flew and flowers still bloomed, nature would find a way to speak to Sophie in its own language. A soft breeze passed through, carrying with it the tender hum of the living forest. Sophie lifted her head, squinting into the sky as sunlight streamed down. She couldn't hear the wind, but her lips curled into a soft smile as if she had just heard something the modern world had long forgotten. Beneath the dappled light of the maple leaves, Sophie stood behind her father, her eyes curious yet unsure, as she looked toward a wooden box at the edge of the wildflower garden. The first beehive she had ever seen in real life. Bees, she realized, were not just black and yellow illustrations in books. They were a living, pulsing current of movement and order. A flicker of fear stirred in her chest when one bee hovered near her hair, but instead of running, she simply took a step back and instinctively clutched the hem of her father's shirt. Thomas bent down, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, his eyes soft like the light at day's end. "They won't hurt you if you don't panic," he said, slowly signing the words in the language they had shared for years. "Be still, close your eyes, feel it through your skin, through your courage." Sophie obeyed. She closed her eyes, standing amidst the flowers and breeze, where the bees were circling around. She couldn't hear the buzzing, but when a bee brushed past her hair, Sophie felt a cool current of airlight, but real glide across her cheek. The wind moved like a soft wave, and in that moment, she felt as though she were standing inside a melody, without notes, only the breath of tiny wings, pulsing, vibrant, and full of love. Thomas gently lifted the lid of the hive. Inside, hundreds of bees were diligently working, their wing beats creating small vibrations that Sophie could clearly feel as she placed her hand on the honeycomb frame. She shivered not from fear, but from wonder, as if an invisible choir had begun to sing a secret song within the hive, and she was the first person to ever listen in such a unique way. Sophie opened her eyes. They sparkled as she looked at her father, then back at the hive. She didn't need to say a word. Thomas simply nodded. In his heart, he knew a door had opened. And somewhere in the quiet wilderness, in the soundless voice of bees, his daughter had begun to listen with her heart. That morning, dew still clung to the pale lavender petals, and Thomas sat with Sophie beneath the porch of the wooden cabin, holding an old book about pollination. He didn't read aloud as usual. Instead, he pointed to an illustration, then turned to his daughter, signing slowly, "Did you know? Flowers can talk to bees." Sophie frowned in surprise. "But how?" she signed. Thomas smiled. plucking a dewy mint flower from the garden. He traced a soft circle in the center of her palm, then scribbled a note on a small piece of paper. When a flower is ready, when there's nectar, it releases a tiny electrical signal. Bees feel it through the ultra-sensitive hairs on their bodies. It's like an invisible invitation. Sophie's eyes widened. She turned to look at the garden where bees floated from bloom to bloom without rest. She began to notice some flowers the bees simply flew past. Some they hovered over, vibrated their wings, then left. But on a few blooms, they lingered longer, turning, pausing on the stamens. Father and daughter spent the whole morning observing. Thomas pointed to each flower: lavender, then wild sunflowers, then mint. Sophie couldn't hear his voice, but she heard through the vibrations of each bee as it zipped past, touched down, and moved on. That afternoon, she opened her notebook and carefully wrote with her pencil. Flowers don't speak with sound, bees don't sing with words, but I can still hear them. She marked that page with a pressed lavender petal. Thomas read it, saying nothing. He gently pulled Sophie into an embrace. In her soundless world, there bloomed another realm of sensation, subtle and profound. And within his heart, a quiet gratitude swelled that nature, somehow, had found its way into his daughter's soul, not through sound, but through the silent rhythm of life. The summer afternoon drifted by like a gentle breath. Sophie and Thomas sat side by side beside the beehive, needing no words to understand one another. Gone were the heavy silences of their first days in the forest now. Between them flowed a nameless language, born of glances, small nods, and the shared motion of carefully lifting the honeycomb frame from its wooden box, watching each delicate wing in motion. Thomas bent down, dipped his fingertip into a bowl of water, then sprinkled a few grains of pink Himalayan salt across the surface, fine as dust. Sophie watched intently, then nodded in understanding. She mimicked him, gently pouring water into an old bottle cap and placing it beside the mint flowers where the bees most often came. When one bee arrived, she followed it with sparkling ice, not out of curiosity, but empathy. Thomas signed to her, showing how to spot pollen clinging to a bee's legs. He opened his notebook and sketched a simple diagram. When the honeycomb darkens to deep brown, it's time to replace it. When honey thickens and glows golden in the corners of the hive, it's ready to be harvested. Sophie copied each detail into her small notebook, the handwriting crooked but focused. One time, Sophie accidentally dropped a honeycomb frame. She turned quickly to her father in panic, but Thomas only rested a hand on her shoulder and smiled, his eyes warm. No scolding, just a look that told her, mistakes are part of learning, and he was always there. She began to realize that even though she couldn't hear the deep timbre of her father's voice, she could listen in other ways. The rhythm of his breath as he opened the hive, the squeeze of his hand when they successfully collected honey, and that unspoken hum, impossible to describe, that surrounded them both like a silent symphony of life. It wasn't just the sound of nature. It was the sound of a father always there, patiently waiting for his daughter to find her way back into a rhythm beyond words. And Sophie, with a heart trained to listen, had finally responded. In a world without sound, love still echoes through the simplest of things. That morning felt different. There was no familiar buzzing near the windowsill, no flash of golden wings weaving between lavender blossoms. Sophie stepped out onto the porch and stood for a long time, fists gently clenched at her sides. The wind still blew, the leaves still rustled, but something was missing. A rhythm tiny, yet constant, that had become part of her world. It felt like the pause between two heartbeats, restless, unplaceable. Thomas noticed immediately. He skipped his morning coffee, said nothing, and silently lifted the lid of the hive. Inside, the bees were sparse. The remaining ones moved sluggishly, scattered. "The queen might be having trouble," he murmured, "or the flowers might be contaminated." Sophie couldn't hear him, but she saw his face and knew something was wrong. She turned back inside and grabbed her notebook and pencil, her usual tools when monitoring the bees. But today, the blank page remained empty and still. 2 weeks later, the father and daughter decided to follow the trail of wings, hoping to find the reason behind the bees' disappearance. They ventured deep into the forest behind the farm where bees usually gathered pollen from wild myrtle and white daisies. Sophie's footsteps were light, her eyes scanning every worn path. Thomas walked ahead, turning back now and then to signal his daughter, as if they were both navigating a maze woven with worry. Then they saw Ida clearing littered with trash, food wrappers, plastic bottles, and worst of all, fresh traces of insecticide spray. Someone had camped here and left behind silent, death-likely unaware of what they had done. Flowers once in full bloom now drooped lifelessly. A few bee carcasses lay scattered among the yellowed petals. Sophie knelt down, gently touching a paper-thin bee wing, then looked up at her father. No tears, just a look sorrowful and choked with grief. Thomas sat beside her. "You see," he whispered, almost to himself, "they're so small people forget. They have a right to live too." Sophie wrote in her notebook, "If the world goes quiet from the lack of bees, it's because humans silenced it themselves." In that forest where life once hummed, today's silence rang like a bell. And in their eyes, father and daughter shared a vow that needed no words. "We will do something, before it's too late." That afternoon, golden sunlight filtered softly through the maple leaves, bathing the little garden behind their cabin in a quiet warmth. The buzz of bees was still absent, but something inside Thomas and Sophie had shifted. They were no longer still. They began to sow hope again through hands, through action, and through a fragile kind of faith, like a bud just beginning to bloom. Thomas pulled a small wooden cart out from the shed, loading it with movable flower pots, lavender, mint, Coropsis species Sophie had once labeled in her notebook with the note, "Bees love these." Together, they pushed the cart down the old forest trail to the clearing, once marred by trash and chemicals. There, they began to clean, picking up broken glass, plastic bags, every leftover trace of neglect. Sophie said nothing, but her eyes lit up every time she uprooted a clump of weeds to replace it with a new myrtle shrub. She gently set out shallow dishes of water, dropping in small stones to serve as landing spots for the bees. Then she sat down, opened her notebook, and began to draw small signs with simple images: a flower crossed out with a "no spraying" symbol, a bee drinking from a dish, a hand sowing seeds. Thomas placed the signs along the forest road, not large, not flashy, but each carried the heart of a father and a child pleading with the world in the softest way possible. Please, be gentle with life. One day passed, then two. Still, no bees returned. On the third day, while Sophie was bending down to water the patch of white daisies, she felt a slight vibration brushing against her arm. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ground. It was a familiar movement, gentle, steady, and warm, like a touch from nature itself. She looked up and she saw it. A bee. Tiny, golden brown, hovering slowly around the freshly bloomed flower. Then came another, and another. Sophie placed her hand over her chest, saying nothing, but her eyes sparkled, holding a whole sky of joy. Thomas stood behind her, quietly placing a hand on her shoulder. He didn't need to ask. He knew his daughter was hearing with her skin, her heart, with the very rhythm of life whispering once again in a forest that had nearly forgotten how to breathe. They hadn't just brought flowers back to the woods. they had brought something far sweeter than honey: hope. That evening, the fading sunlight bathed the branches in soft gold, filtering through the leaves like nature's lullaby. A breeze carried the scent of mint and pollen, blended with the hum of bees from the hive on the porch, a sound Sophie could not hear, but one she felt resonate clearly in her chest. Thomas stepped outside, a small box wrapped in soft linen and tied with simple twine in his hands. He didn't say a word, just sat beside his daughter, who was carefully recording the hive's behavior in her notebook. Sophie looked at him, head tilted curiously. Thomas smiled and placed the box on her lap, nodding gently an invitation to open something important. Sophie untied the string and lifted the lid. Inside was a simple leather bracelet, rustic and warm. The charm was engraved with a six-sided honeycomb, and next to it, a small line of raised lettering she could read by touch. "You taught me how to listen." Her small hand trembled as she traced the words. Then she looked up at her father, her eyes glistening with tears. Thomas lowered his head and pulled her into a tight embrace, their first hug since arriving. No words, no sound, but in that moment, their hearts beat in perfect unisono harmony, not born from speech, but from love. Behind them, the hive still hummed. Sophie couldn't hear it, but she could feel it through her skin, through the quiet rhythm of the universe whispering something sacred. In the peaceful woods of Vermont, where nature became the language, a bond between father and daughter, once fractured by silence and grief, was finally mended through all that remained unspoken. The girl clutched the bracelet to her chest and closed her eyes, and in that thudding heart, she whispered silently, "I've learned how to listen too, from the love you never had to say aloud." The sun set slowly behind the treetops, and in that golden dusk, two people, two world shad, found each other again. At the end of summer, as the first maple leaves blushed with red across the Vermont sky, Sophie sat by the window, sunlight dancing across a blank page. She was writing her essay for the new school year, each word carefully shaped, just like the vibrations she had come to understand throughout the break. The hive that speaks without sound. In her essay, Sophie wrote about the first time she touched the honeycomb frame, about how bees danced to share the path to flowers, about the silent language she had learned not from human speech, but from connection through eyes, hands, and hearts. She wrote, "I cannot hear, but I still understand, because nature doesn't speak in words, it speaks in life." When the teacher finished reading, she sat still for a moment, then quietly wept. Not out of pity, but because she was moved by a world so few people are still quiet enough to truly feel. When Thomas read his daughter's draft, he gently squeezed her shoulder. In his eyes, there was no trace of fatigue, only a quiet, glowing pride. A few weeks later, he began a project he'd never dared imagine before, opening a workshop for deaf and disabled children, not to fix them, but to teach them to listen in the same way nature had taught his daughter. No need for sound, just emotion and sensation. Sophie became his main assistant. She would take the hands of the children and gently place them on the beehive. She taught them how to recognize flowers by the frequency of vibrations, how to feel the rhythm of the bees through their cheeks, through their palms. The once quiet children began to laugh, to point, to take notes, and to write down feelings no hearing aid could ever provide, the sensation of being connected to living things. The hive continued to hum every afternoon, delicate wings stirring the air, sending out signals no one could see but everyone could feel, if only they listened. Thomas placed a small sign beside the hive, hand-carved and smooth to the touch. "To listen to the earth, you don't need earsenly heart." And Sophithi girl who once lived in silence had now opened that door for countless other young souls, just as the bees and her father had once opened hers. Bees are not just tiny creatures fluttering around flowers each day, they are the quiet timekeepers of life on this planet. About 75% of the world's food crops depend on the pollination of bees and other pollinators. Without them, fruits would dwindle, vegetables would vanish, and seeds, the beginning of all life, would no longer be able to continue their journey. Apples, strawberries, cucumbers, almonds, and even coffee all carry the trace of a bee's gentle visit. Bees don't just help plants bear fruit, they preserve biodiversity in ecosystems. The vibrant forests, the dancing wildflower fields, would grow silent without the unseen footsteps of the bees. But bees are disappearing because of pesticides, because of climate change, because fields are being turned to concrete day by day. And if they vanish, so too does our hold on life. Action must begin today. From you, from me, from every little garden, every balcony, every decision to say no to pesticides. Plant flowers for the bees. Leave a shallow bowl of water outside your porch. Teach children that a single bee can help feed the entire world. And remember, every act of kindness toward nature, no matter how small, is a spark of hope. Let us act together for the bees and for our shared future. If this story and its message touched your heart, like the video to lend strength to every voice working to protect our planet. Share it with someone you love so that this message won't end here, but spread like wildflowers blooming in a desert. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss other heartfelt stories about nature, family, and the journey to heal this earth. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll always be the first to feel inspired by acts of kindness, like the gentle hum of a bee returning to a blooming garden. Because when we save the bees, we are preserving something sacred, life itself, live,